I'm very excited to talk with Sara today. Just so folks know, if you've been seeing her, you probably have already heard this, but I will tell you again. The QR code up there, if you have a question about anything landscape architecture related, please scan the code, drop it in the box, and we will see it up here and we'll happily answer it. Or I guess Sara will happily answer it. I'll just be here. But Sara, I'm really excited to have you here today because, well, I guess the first place I want to start, I think a lot of us will think about nature being its own thing, the built environment being its own thing. Landscape architecture sounds like it's both those things together. So can you just give us a little sense of what this field actually is?
Yeah. Actually, could I get a show of hands or if you're familiar with what landscape architecture is?
You're good at this. I should have asked.
Oh, that's a good number of people. I wonder what percentage of that population believes it to mostly be designing backyards, because that's typically what I get. I am a landscape architect, and what is landscape architecture? I mean, broadly speaking, we're trained to design and shape land. The term landscape architecture originates from the mid-19th century and is typically associated with Frederick Law Olmsted. How many folks are familiar with who Frederick Law Olmsted is? The same people raising their hands. And he coins this term because of his belief that it's different than the practice of gardening. He believes that it's a profession that can actually engage some of the bigger challenges of the society, and he dedicates himself largely to public parks. But from that tradition, we have a history of about 160 years of landscape architecture in North America and consequentially around the world, of a profession that's trained to design landscapes. And I entered this profession. I'm from the Gulf Coast, and when I was in college, not knowing what I wanted to do with my life, Hurricane Katrina, brewed and barreled towards my home state of Louisiana. And it was that event that really prompted me to start to research different professions, different disciplinary frameworks, ways to understand, the factors that lead into something like a Hurricane Katrina from an ecology standpoint, from an infrastructure standpoint, politics, and its aftermath. And then, what might be an empowering framework to actually intervene and shape those factors, looking ahead.
Okay, so this is a very high-level view, and I'm wondering if you can give us a few, no pun intended, a few concrete examples of what landscape architecture actually looks like.
Funny that you ask. I can pull up some images. If we could get some images up on the screen. So I can share a few examples of projects that my office, I'm the principal of a firm called Sara Zewde, and we're based in New York City. And a lot of our work is actually around mitigating and adapting the changes in land. Climate change is not something in the future. Our climate is changing, our land is changing, and therefore we have to devise ways to live in a rapidly changing and dynamic landscape. Landscape architecture cannot just be about pretty paths and places to picnic. We have to have an infrastructural lens on the places that we love. This is a project that we're working on in Monrovia, the capital of Liberia. It's the lowest lying world capital. And our client is the World Monuments Fund. And this is a historically significant island in the history of Liberia. But it is kind of at the front lines of a lot of the ecological vulnerability that the region is facing. And so the design is very much about mangrove restoration, ecological restoration, but at the same time being able to tell the historical and cultural narratives of conflict resolution and peace that the country has seen since 2005. And so, issues of climate change are not distinct or separate from how we understand national narratives, cultural narratives, and cultural resilience. And so this is another project that we're working on in Washington, D.C. With the climate getting warmer, this particular neighborhood has seen a lot of historical disinvestment is 7 degrees hotter on average than another neighborhood in the same city. And so the design of this landscape then is really about optimizing canopy and shade. and about creating an urban oasis. Just to, create a space to even be outside requires quite a bit of investment and attention going forward. In this particular case, we're also creating a microclimate using water features and that kind of thing. This is a project in Philadelphia called Graffiti Pier. Philadelphia is actually the city that invented graffiti. They like to let us New Yorkers know. And this site, Graffiti Pier, is important to that history and legacy. And in 25 years, it'll be inundated just by high tides. So we've been actually working with graffiti writers to come up with an approach to removing the bulkheads and introducing an intertidal landscape so that this park can shift upland and inland as the tides continue to rise. And so, I'll end with one more project. This is Dia Beacon, a museum in upstate New York that lies in a historical floodplain. Toni Morrison has this incredible quote where she talks about the idea of flooding, and that a lot of languages don't even have the word flooding. She says we should think of flooding as remembering. It's the land remembering where water once was. And so the design of this landscape is really about recalling the historic floodplain of the river, embracing water, making water visible to how we understand the land. And so we've been designing a series of sculptural landforms that help make visible the history and presence of water as it continues to change over the course of time. We're converting 5 acres of lawn into over 90 species of native species of meadows, and really making the way that we're designing land for change not an infrastructure project solely, but also a cultural, recreational, and kind of important to our cultural lives, central to our cultural lives. So that gives you maybe a sense of how I'm thinking about the role that landscape design plays in a changing climate.
Okay, that was an incredible sense. Thank you. Wow, that was the best sense I could imagine. Thank you. And I do want to stick on this project at Dia Beacon for a sec, because this is a place I've visited a few times. And if you had asked me, is this place in a floodplain? I would have said, I don't think so. But it is, and it sounds like you're making this visible to people like me who clearly didn't get the memo. But how do you sort of uncover this? How do you come to see the landscape that did exist?
It's a really great question. And actually, I blame my profession for your experience of the land and how we experience the land broadly. I mean, we don't even know what the native plants of the places that we live look like. So landscape architecture has neutralized how we understand the earth. And I'm really interested in the potential for that to be expressed as a way to mobilize our consciousness around climate change. Now, how do we understand that? Typically, my practice is really about a lot of research, and I don't mean just Google. I mean observation.
Wait, there's more than Google?
I know. I mean observing the land, and that's a practice that takes a lot of time, and that I encourage you all to do in the landscapes that you all inhabit. Looking down at the ground, where is the presence of water? Why do these plants grow here versus these plants grow here? You don't have to, read a report. The earth is a collection of its pasts. And so we do a lot of research in a lot of different ways. That project in particular, we also spoke with indigenous people about the history of that site. So all of these different ways of knowing are really important to being able to unlock and express, the dynamism of a particular place.
And I mean, Dia Beacon is a fairly nice museum. I'm going to guess it has some money to spend on these kinds of things. And Philadelphia is a large city. DC, also a large city. These are places that have a lot of capital to spend on making these landscapes. Liberia strikes me as a place that probably doesn't have that same level of capital investment. And I'm wondering, how do you make sure that this really important work is available to everyone?
Yeah. I mean, landscape architecture has and landscapes have an interesting role to investment. I mean, some of the highest value real estate on planet Earth lines Central Park. And so how we invest in landscapes, there's actually a lot of wealth that can be generated from that. And there's some interesting models that are being developed around capturing that value and making planning around investment as you design landscapes a part of how we think about the process. And so I'm really excited about the possibility of thinking ahead of time about the kind of impacts, the economic impacts of landscapes, particularly in places like Liberia. And so they're really interested in that particular case around this being an investment around tourism, and all of the kind of implications of that. So I'm really excited about how this can mobilize and catalyze a lot of different futures for people.
And to do that, I mean, I feel like in some ways, there's the way things have been done, right? And then what you're doing is maybe reimagining. You're telling a different story to people, essentially. And I'm wondering, what is the role of landscape architecture in particular about telling different stories about the future? We know things need to change to deal with the climate that we have, or that's on the way. How do you tell people a different future than doom and gloom?
Yeah, it's less than 1% of planet Earth the Earth's surface is designed by a landscape architect. So I'm not going to sit up here and tell you we're going to save everything, but because of the densification of the population on planet Earth, actually that under 1% of the Earth's surface plays a big role in our lives. And so I think the stories that we tell and the experiences that we shape in those landscapes that we share in public spaces can help catalyze, really, people's understanding of the Earth is through these landscapes. And that's a big part of the legacy of someone like a Frederick Law Olmsted. He really believed in that. He really believed that, and that's why he advocated for something like 900 acres of a central park. That this is the scale of infrastructure that's critical to a democracy. It's critical to understanding our relationship to the Earth, our relationships to one another, as a part of a civic society. And so I really see, the work of shaping public lands and public landscapes as being catalytic to those questions of how we relate to the Earth and how we relate to one another in a democracy.
So actually, just to stick on the Central Park example for a second, I want to take a question I see here from our audience. This is a question about, do you ever use non-native plants in your work? I mean, Central Park is lovely, but there are certainly parts that are not native to New York.
Large parts.
Yeah, and so, when you do that, how do you decide to make that choice?
That's a really great question, and I'm maybe an atypical landscape architect in this regard. I think the idea of native plants versus non-native is really fraught. How we understand what native plants are typically which plants were here when Europeans arrived, which is a relatively arbitrary moment in the constant migration of plants. It's been happening for hundreds of millions of years. And so it presents a really problematic binary. And so I'm actually a little bit more, I'd like to take a more nuanced approach to understanding how a plant operates in its context, how, is it a friendly neighbor to its community? And also in a changing climate, knowing that these things are dynamic. And so what is native and we really have to be responsive to new contexts and new conditions. And so while I use the word native plants a lot, or the terminology or the framework, I think what's actually more important is the ecological performance of the plant, and it requires some subtlety to really optimize that.
And I think that you bring up this idea that you're working in a changing climate. Like, this is a moving baseline. Like, things are going to change. Like, it's this way now. 10 years, it's going to be different. 20 years, 100 years. There's a lot of change that has to happen. And so, how do you think about, I guess, like building your landscapes so that they're both able to change, but also maybe withstand some of the changes, or do they have to withstand some of the changes?
Yeah, so for instance, in the Graffiti Pier project, this site being so important to the history of graffiti, there are changes. This place is going to be inundated. So part of the work that I'm doing, it requires a lot of community engagement, public engagement, finding what is it about this place in its core that we love. And, coming from the Gulf Coast where so much has changed and we've lost a lot too, I think really being clear with one another about if everything's changing around us, what aspects are the most important to us? And then we can design around, sustaining that in some way. It may not be in its exact form. I don't think there's any like purity about that. But if at Graffiti Pier, if what graffiti artists love is, for instance, they were talking about the presence of rocks and mud and keeping it gritty. Well, the water is going to continue to rise. We can kind of create that condition in a different way. But I think there's a clarity of narrative of, okay, everything is changing. What in our future, the future version of this place, what is the most important thing, and how do we design for that? I think is going to be important.
And you're talking about design for folks that are here now that use these places. And I know this is a question that also came in from our audience that I'm really interested in hearing your response to. Often when you design a beautiful place, people want to live near it. You mentioned, Central Park, some of the most expensive real estate in New York is right on the edges of it. Yeah. And so how do you, make sure you're designing these places for everybody, essentially public space people can access, but that the areas around them, maybe, how do you, think about gentrification and that sort of the fringes of those places?
I actually don't use the G word.
Tell why?
I think it lumps together a lot of different forms of change. Whether are we talking about, the appreciation of land values? Are we talking about densification? Or are we talking about racial dynamics? Are we, what are we, or is it an aesthetic? But recognizing the impact that investments in public landscapes can make, we've been working, for instance, with community land trusts around planning for that change and being able to create mechanisms to capture the value that's generated by the investments in public lands. And there's a great one here that in Seattle that we worked with in the past called the Africa Town Community Land Trust, and they've actually been purchasing property.
Oh, all right.
Okay. Y'all are really the model. I mean, having worked around somebody got really excited. Having worked around the country, Oh no. I hope you're okay. Having worked around the country and around the world, I actually find myself continuing to come back to point to Seattle as a reference and as a model in terms of what's possible when a community organization is working to collectively organize around, coming up with plans for capturing that value.
And I think the last thing I want to ask you about, which ties to this, you're coming back to this place of Seattle. It sounds like a great example, and now I know what I'll do this weekend, which is great to hear. But, for folks, when we're thinking about their local park, maybe their local public space, why should they care about those places?
Yeah. So, this is, since so many people in the room are familiar with Frederick Law Olmsted, I'll share, I'm writing a book about him and this kind of under-historicized part of his legacy, which is that, he committed himself to designing public landscapes after 14 months in the slave South. He was hired by a then fledgling New York Times, New York Daily Times at the time, it was 1852 to 1854, to write about the conditions of slavery. And he comes back with the kind of an understanding around the impacts that slavery had, the corrosive effects of slavery on a notion of civic society. That slavery, the effects on the enslaved, are not to be questioned, but even on the enslavers, that their ability to see each other as human was also diminished by the practice of enslaving other humans. And so he pointed to a dearth of public institutions and a sense of public good as an effect of slavery. And he committed himself to the idea that it would take hundreds of years to overcome that, and that public space was part of the constellation of public good, in education, museums, that would really help to mitigate those effects. And so seeing, he really saw public space as a facility, a place, a training facility for our democracy, for how we relate to one another, that this is a kind of a neutral place, if you know, in an idealized sense, in terms of relations between people, but also relationship to the earth and to nature. And so I really do, it's why I entered the field, is the belief in that potential, that these places can be catalytic to our understanding of the earth and to each other.
Thanks, Sarah. That's really interesting. I think it's a great way to think about when I go home, look at my park. I'm in Oakland, so I'll be looking at Lake Merritt. You'll be able to look at Central Park. And I hope everyone here will take a chance to look at there's public spaces in a different way, too. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you.